Okay,
Right.
James, I'm gonna hand it
I
over to
like
you.
how it gives me the option to leave just then and there. It's like, would you like to, you want to get out of here?
Back out. No, you're not allowed to back out, James.
Well, all right. Well, thank you, Maria. It's good to be with you again and the Salford community, and I'll say, when Maria asked me to provide another seminar on pandemic related stress, I said I was glad to do it, but also, warned her that sequels rarely live up to the originals, except perhaps a few exceptions. Lord of the Rings is like that for me. I like those books and the movies. Thought they were pretty good. In fact, the first place where me and my friends at Eastern lived, which is kind of tucked in the woods, we affectionately called the Shire. But that's off the rails already, so we're off to a good start. Let's not spend too much time talking about Tolkien. But I want to begin tonight in a very similar way that I began the previous time we were together. And really with an acknowledgement that while there might be some shared experiences throughout the pandemic, each of us, of course, are unique. And our experiences are unique, which means that not everything I say will apply to you. So what's a good posture to take tonight? I would encourage you to be aware of the things that connect with you personally, that apply to you and yourself, and approach the things that don't connect with you as kind of a window into other people's experiences, a window into loved ones or coworkers or other people in the community. And I believe when we understand ourselves and others more fully, we're able to love ourselves and others more deeply. I don't think I'm alone in that in this room. So it's been several months since I was here last, and the weather's gone from freezing to warm. The trees that were once absent of leaves are now green. Flowers are in bloom. Many of us and our loved ones are vaccinated and able to consider engaging with life in a way that just wasn't possible over the past year. Song and people have returned to sanctuary. How about that? That's a pretty amazing thing. So the question is this, for many people, why is it that many of us are still struggling? Why is it that so many of our family members, friends, or even yourself are finding yourself anxious, or sliding towards depression or some sort of grief? This past April, I watched as a New York Times article was posted by many of my friends on Facebook, the title of which was, "There's a name for the blah you're feeling. It's called languishing." I wonder if any of you read that as it came out and said, yes, that's it. The article was by Adam Grant, and it went on to define languishing as really the void between depression and flourishing, an absence of wellness. He also referred to it as the neglected middle child of the mental health field, which kind of cracked me up because, he could have been right by that, but I think there's a lot of neglected children in the mental health field, and most of them are just called therapists, actually. Yeah, little therapist joke there. Yeah. So this is where I'd like to begin today, by reminding you that there's nothing wrong with you if you're still languishing, by reminding you that we are still living during one of the world's great calamities, you might say. I won't go into the various statistics related to the losses that have occurred around the world as a result of the pandemic. I'd wager that you've heard those numbers and seen those images over time and time again here. You carry it, and the natural response to carrying such loss is, of course, to languish. Some of the challenges we are faced with in May are indeed different than the ones we experienced in November. As many of us navigate re-entry into our communities, consider leaving our protective bubbles that kept us so safe for so long, there's one thing that remains the same tonight, though, which is that my big takeaway point, which is if you're going to do anything during this time for yourself, it's really that you have to be lowering your expectations for yourself to be, operating optimally, you might say. It's okay not to be okay right now. Again, it's not that you're languishing or that I'm languishing. It's that we are. And so if you're feeling bad because the smiles don't come as frequently or the words are harder to muster up on the company of loved ones, it's okay. Me too. You know? And while it is true that we are in many ways all in this together, that we are in many ways in the same boat, I think it's also true that some people, some families feel in a very real way like they are in a boat all on their own. And like the story of Job reminds us, not all challenges are divided equally among us mortals, right? And if this is you or your family, and you find yourself in a boat all on your own, I just want to acknowledge you and send you a special word of encouragement. Quoting one patient of the psychiatrist, Dr. Irvin Yalom, he was a pretty published guy, but when you're alone in your own boat, it's often a comfort to see the warm lights of the other boats floating in the distance. It's an image that has really helped me when I felt isolated in the past, and I hope that it helps you too. So I have to admit that I've been accused of overdoing it with nautical metaphors in the past, both in sessions and probably in seminars like this. No joke. One time, after using an Emily Dickinson quote that I like, the sailor can't see north, but knows the needle can. A particular favorite of mine. A client burst out into laughter soon after saying, I'm sorry, but that's the third time you've used some sort of boat imagery in our session. And I'm starting to feel a bit seasick. In response, I kind of narrowed my eyes and said, you're really taking the wind out of my sails with that observation there. Tonight, I'd like to spend time talking about some new dilemmas as well that have surfaced during this stage of the pandemic. And if this were, some sort of writing pandemic-specific mental health book seminar, I'd probably call this chapter, Sorry to Burst Your Bubble. It was nearly a year ago that many of us began the difficult but necessary process of forming our pandemic bubbles. And then these inner circles were the people we viewed as essential to our lives, such as grandparents involved with childcare, or housemates who'd be writing out things with us because we lived in the same place as we did, whether we liked it or not. In talking with people about bubble formation, I was always impressed by how much open communication and intentionality there was, not only to the formation of bubbles, but to the maintenance of them. There was often open dialogue about who was spending time where outside the bubble. And when comfort levels were exceeded, that was talked about. There was so much communication about what felt good and what didn't feel good that I couldn't help but think to myself that no small portion of trauma is being offset by this, by all that good communication. And while it wasn't an easy thing by any means to maintain bubble life, I think it did make things easier by the attention that was paid to our own wishes, our fears, as well as others. For many, something that has been a unique stress during this time, in this new stage of the pandemic here in the spring, it's been the lack of communication related to the expanding of bubble boundaries. I'm curious, how many of you found out indirectly that someone in your bubble was now doing things differently than before, either spending time with others indoors, unmasked, or attending group gatherings. How many of you feel like things are changing in your bubbles without much open communication about that? It's just sort of happening. How does that feel? Not always great, I'm guessing. Well, I want to tell you that, if this is you, if you woke up one day and realized that your bubble has been popped, you're not alone. This is one of the big stressors unique to our current place in the pandemic. So why is this happening, right? Well, one theory, of course, is always that we're callous and other people are callous, and people didn't really care as much as they thought they did, or we thought they did, as evidenced by not being included in the debubbling process more. Well, maybe, but I would suggest another theory. I would suggest that it is arguably a harder thing to open up boundaries after a crisis than it is to set boundaries going into a crisis. And what I mean is that, it feels more natural to move towards shelter in the face of real and present danger than it does to leave shelter when that danger has lessened. I'm reminded by the many families I've sat with who've locked up all the kitchen knives and medications after one of their family members committed a serious act of self-harm. And I would often ask when I was with those families, when the person was home and they were sort of getting resettled, how will you know it's time to take out the knives again? Usually followed by, which knife do you want to take out first? You don't have to do them all at once. For some people, the answer is the steak knife. Others, it might be the potato peeler. In my opinion, there isn't really a right one to start with. It's just important that these decisions are made together. So that is a hard thing to imagine going through, yes. But it's also hard to be faced with similar dilemmas in your own life. How will you know it's time to expand your bubble? Which ways will you gather first? When is hugging the kids okay again? These questions are incredibly important to discuss with everybody in the inner circles. And one way to prevent the relational ruptures common to debubbling is to engage in the same intentional and open discussion that define the bubbling process at the start of everything. And if that type of intentionality and openness did not reflect your own bubbling experience, it was more like, hey, I guess we're in a bubble now, or, that's okay. It's still probably a good idea to take time talking in detail with your loved ones about your plans, about your wishes, about your fears, and investigate what the others in your life are feeling about those things too. This won't eliminate the stress, of course, involved with change. Stress is always part of significant change, both good and bad, but it might go a long way to reduce the stress. And if you find out that the bubble that served you and your loved ones so well is no longer needed, or just kind of non-existent now, given that everyone's already doing their own thing, I still might suggest that you punctuate that ending in some way. Maybe use some sort of ritual or formal acknowledgement of that ending, if and when it comes. Rituals, and if you were at my other talk, you've heard me say this, but rituals have a way of bonding people together and integrating parts of our experience into the greater story of our lives. And rituals are often an important part of processing and integrating traumas in life. Speaking of traumas, while preparing for this seminar, I wondered how much I should spend on the topic of trauma. Trauma is certainly relevant to our seminar tonight. My dilemma as a speaker is that I know how draining it can be to listen to descriptions of acute stress, and trauma is certainly that. As I prepared, I was reminded of these mental health conventions I go to. You got your depression workshop at 10, you got anxiety at 11, traumas at 1, and so on. By the end, you're kind of ready to check yourself into the clinic. So, I keep that in mind as I talk about that. But, I'd like to say a few things about the idea of trauma. I think that we are all fairly familiar with the word. It's a word that's often used by people to describe their reaction to something bad that happened in life. Maybe you've heard someone say, I was traumatized by that, or it was traumatic. I think most people know this type of stress as it refers to lingering effects of some terrible or sudden event that has happened. That isn't a bad way to think about it, actually, but I'd like to talk a little more about some of the nuances of trauma and what factors lead something to becoming traumatic rather than just disturbing or unpleasant. Let me start by saying that there isn't really one combination of experiences that leads to an experience being traumatic for someone personally. Trauma is complex and often is contingent upon a combination of things like personality, relational history, community supports, other factors. And with that said, something that often increases the likelihood of someone becoming traumatized by an event is related to whether or not the person felt powerless in the face of what's happened to them. Also, something can become traumatic when someone experiences a combination of helplessness combined with the kind of stress that overwhelms their ability to cope. Given what's going on during this pandemic, I think you understand why this comes up in our conversation. One of the symptoms of trauma is someone being trapped in an ongoing state of helplessness and feelings of overwhelmment. Even after the stressful event itself has ended or the danger has lessened. Another way to put that is that when you're traumatized, you're sort of living in a timeless state of helplessness. So again, this is why it's important to have open conversations with loved ones about moving forward, sort of punctuate where we are in this timeline. Conversations like that, they add a sense of control. They help people feel a little less helpless. And feeling less helpless, or that you have more agency in life, is often an antidote to trauma. And with that in mind, I want to further our conversation on debubbling and add sort of just another way to help one another feel less helpless and navigate this next stage of the pandemic. And what I want to talk to you now about is the topic, the language of consent. One of the many gifts of the Me Too movement that went viral in 2017, I think, was the new and sorely needed emphasis on the topic of consent. Let me tell you, since Me Too gained a lot of notoriety, it's been pretty neat to listen to students at various levels of school and just people at different places in life as they expand and increase their understanding of this language of consent. It's really does feel like that's happening more and more. What is consent? A quick Google search brings up the definition. Consent is permission for something to happen or an agreement to do something. Permission for something to happen, an agreement to do something. Simple enough, right? And I think it's a useful thing to be thinking about as we all navigate new social situations this summer. For example, when we meet up with friends or family members, do they want me to wear a mask, even if we're both vaccinated? You might be thinking, I'm vaccinated, and I'm sure they'd like to give me a hug, or I'd sure like to give them a big hug. But are they comfortable with that? How about this? A hypothetical situation. I'm a grandparent, and I'm about to watch the grandchildren, and it's good to finally give the parents a break. But maybe I'll pop into Landis's and grab us some lunch while we're there. So the consent question here is, are the grandchildren's parents okay with them being brought inside a grocery store? Have you faced scenarios like this? Is that sort of bringing up your own experiences as I talk about it? The reality is this: not everybody is going to shift their comfort levels, their boundaries, their bubbles at the same time. And some people are going to play it safe for as long as possible. Others are ready to take advantage of what leaders say is now possible, removing masks ASAP. So we cannot expect a uniform or consistent response to how quickly people adjust. It's another reason why consent becomes an important part of the conversation. Checking in with issues of consent, frequently is one of the ways to prevent relational ruptures during this time. And again, I think it adds a much needed sense of control to people's lives. And a sense of control almost always increases one's sense of relief and safety. And although I'm probably preaching to the choir on this one, I just want to add that, the way you gain consent, of course, is by asking someone if that's okay. One thing I would add to this conversation on consent is this, too, that, consent is a dynamic thing, which means that just because you were okay with something before doesn't mean you have to be okay with it going forward. You can change things. You can adjust what feels safe. You can say yes one time. You can say no another time. Consent just helps people feel like they are important and empowered. And consent, when it's part of the conversation, really helps everyone feel safer and able to have more fun, you might say. So I'm going to go on a limb and say, while many of you, maybe all of you, might have been really loving that last talking point on consent. Others might be groaning a bit, thinking, this is all a bit much, James. I'm starting to feel like I need some sort of handbook to interact with other humans on this planet Earth. Don't worry, you're still muted. I didn't hear any literal groans. I just know that, when I give a seminar like this, that often both reactions are present when I talk about stuff like this. If this was you, just let me say that, yes, this is a lot. I would also say that it's important. An important thing to remember is that we are in a particularly difficult stage of the pandemic. It's been terrible this past year. For many of us, it's been like we've been in the desert with very little water, and now we have a swimming pool in front of us. And you're telling me I can't jump in? My encouragement is this. Remember that we won't be in this spot forever. Some of the decisions, some of the stressors involved with relationships right now won't feel the same in 6 months. If we're gentle and mindful about how we proceed now, it will mean a lot later on that when the dangers are farther behind us, that we didn't take as much damage along the way. And in this process, I think we can offset no small degree of relational turmoil also, and trauma, by continuing to act and be gentle with ourselves and others. It's not great job security for me as a therapist, but I'll say, I'd recommend that all the same. You know what I mean? It's next I want to talk about another pandemic-related experience that has started to become more and more common at this stage in the pandemic. There's something I've noticed in people's experiences more and more over these past months. There are many names for what I'm about to talk about, but perhaps the most common, and I don't love this term, is called a midlife crisis. Yeah. I don't really like this term because it's not just middle-aged people who experience this sort of thing. And the term is also tied to like images of buying red convertibles and like having affairs with others half your age. I think a better term is existential crisis, which is defined as a feeling of uneasiness or dread about meaning in life, about purpose, choices, and freedoms. And while, yes, some react to existential crises with affairs and fast cars, I find that most people who experience them do not. And let me ask you this, in the past year, have you observed in yourself or in others major changes in the type of work that you do, where you work? How about major changes in your relationships or where you live? Have you considered or made any major changes in your spiritual activities, either internal to yourself, or even externally? If you've answered yes to one or more of these questions, I want to say that, you're not alone. Recently, I listened to one psychologist term this time that we're living in, one of the ways we can think about it, as the great reassessment. I really liked that when I heard it. Now, here's the thing. Death often changes a person. Death changes a person? Yeah, James, it does, because the dead person is dead. That's not what I mean. What I mean is that the feeling of being in the presence of death, or you might say the real or perceived danger in life, it changes a person, especially if you have been living with that presence for an extended period of time. There's only a few life events that have the power to jolt us out of the comfortable routines, the automated ways of being in the world. Some events take away the illusion that things will just be working out right because we're good, that we've been doing good all along. Our feeling of safety is often shattered after when we go through a crisis. It can lead to something like an existential crisis. And the dread that accompanies an existential crisis often leads us to feel disoriented, sleepless, leaves us anxious. And we want to run back, of course, to that place in which life felt more predictable or more understandable, when we felt like we had some sense of control, you might say. So what are we to do when nostalgia dominates our life experience? One suggestion I have is this, honor and accept the feelings of grief that are connected to what was lost, but also, resist the urge to reclaim what was. Resist the urge to reclaim what was. It's an interesting idea. What your relationship was, you might say, or what the world was, or who yourself were. Oftentimes couples, they come to therapy after some event has destabilized their relationship. Not all of them, but some do. Some sort of crisis. And when this happens, there is often this wish to return to a past time in the relationship when things felt safer, when there was less uncertainty, and while the wish to is, absolutely understandable to sort of reclaim that, it can be a trap in a way. In efforts to hold on to or recreate past relationships, past experience in the relationship, it can lead to further frustration and pain. Sometimes one of the most important questions I ask a couple whose sense of meaning or purpose and freedom has been shattered by some sort of event is this. It's clear to me that your first marriage is over. Would you like to have a second? It's a provocative question, I know. And let me be clear that the purpose of that question is not to suggest an ending to their actual relationship. Rather, it's an acknowledgement that moving forward likely means setting about the hard work of co-creating a new sense of purpose, reshaping the meaning and reforming freedoms, all in a way that will allow them to move forward. Forward, you might say, is the direction of life. And an existential crisis can be sort of a stuckness with the grief of loss. But these are often the same tasks important for getting through any existential crisis, not just a couple relationship or a marital relationship, tasks of redefining meaning, purpose, and freedoms. So if you've realized that this is part of what you are dealing with, that it's an existential crisis of some sort, maybe consider asking yourself these questions. What parts of my life have lost meaning or purpose over the course of the pandemic? Just as important is the question, what new ways am I experiencing purpose or meaning in my life? Answers to questions like this will often expose the ways in which we are stuck and also sort of give us a map to the sorts of changes that will help us move forward. Not that long ago, Mosaic Conference's Emily Ralph Servant visited my home congregation there at Methacton and gave a sermon on composting. Yes, composting. There are some very creative pastors out there. And, I know that some of you in this room share that quality. She used the imagery of a gardener who composts old parts of a garden to create new growth, allowing some things to die so that other things might live. Now, I remember this sermon because I was sort of in awe. It was a wonderful way to imagine one of the connections between loss and life. Yeah, you might say the connection between stagnation and growth is another way to think about it. Yeah, she asked, what parts of our lives must we let die so that our soil might be ready for new growth? So again, if you're recognizing that the part of the dread you feel is because of an existential crisis, I think these are great images and they can be helpful in thinking about life after 2020. And remember, a very wise man once said, don't be afraid to start over again. This time, you're not starting from scratch. You're starting from experience. It's Tyrion Lannister from Game of Thrones. I'm not advocating watching Game of Thrones. It's a pretty brutal show, but I kind of like that quote that came out of it. So before we wind down tonight, I think it's important to spend time talking about the reality that this past year has been incredibly hard on relationships. We'll talk a little more about that. And yes, it's been in large part due to the stressors of the pandemic, but I'll suggest that the fragmentation in our society, communities, and families, and even ourselves has been something that has been going on for long, even before the pandemic. It's been part of our lives even before COVID-19 was with us. And when I say fragmentation, what I mean is that the relational bonds or the relational bridges that once connected people have become more and more tenuous or frayed. And in some cases, those bridges have been completely dynamited altogether. Why is this happening? I would suggest that there isn't really truly one reason for it. I don't think there's one smoking gun for that sort of crisis, so to speak. And anyone that suggests there are, I don't know, they're probably selling you something. But why? Because something I think about is crises will always expose the parts of relationships that were in need of growth, or you yourself, the ways that you were in need of adaptation. Like if there was a need for emotional support in a relationship, sometimes that's exposed by a crisis because emotional support is just that much more needed. Or if there is enough recognition of our individuality in a relationship, I think that some of that becomes more acute in a crisis because we all just are in desperate need of acknowledgement of who we are, that type of acceptance that is part of love and loving others. So what can we do about that? First I'd say recognize if what I said reflects some part of your own experience. Have you found yourselves and your loved ones sort of fractured, or certain people in your lives exiled, you might say? Are you yourself exiled somewhere? Some of you might know this to be true right away when I say this. Others might wish to do some journaling about it. Another good way to discern whether relationships are in need of attention right now is your dreams. Yes, and dreams. What are you, one of those Freudians, James? One of those? Not entirely, but I will suggest that dreams are a very, underutilized part of ourselves. They can give us such important information about ourselves. And sometimes a roadmap to healing or what it is we need to address. To reference one chapter, again, going back to the psychiatrist, Dr. Irvin Yalom, he has one chapter entitled Dreams, Use Them, Use Them, Use Them. And so if you have a dream journal, it's usually good to start jotting things down in there and see what comes out of it. But what if the person I want to be closer to is fundamentally different from me at their core, James? I mean, they voted for you-know-who. And before you think I'm making this political, or who I'm talking about, let me just say that we all have a version of you-know-who, a person that represents some fundamental departure from our personal value system. But to address this barrier, I'd like to suggest something important about people, that people are, in many ways, much more like pizzas than they are onions. Yes, stick with me on this. In my view, one of the things that keeps people from connecting with one another is the widely held belief that people are like onions, that people have layers. And when you peel back those layers, you're coming closer to some sort of core part of the self. And while I think this isn't a terrible way to think about people, there's some truth to it. One of the dilemmas is if you look at people like this, you will likely stop trying to connect with them if you think that there's something fundamentally different at their center. You've likely heard this onion way of talking about people before. A much less common food metaphor for people is the image of a pizza. But I would suggest that it's a more useful one at times. As you visualize the image of a pizza, it's helpful to think about, one slice where a pizza that's been cut into many different slices, and each one has kind of a different topping on it. One might have you just be plain, another pepperoni, one has broccoli, another might have like pineapple. Maybe you're one of those weirdos, you know? Yeah, I like the pineapple pizza, by the way. Yeah. But how does this image apply to people? Or how does this help us? I would suggest that, you know, like this pizza image, people also are composed of different parts. You might call one part a rational or logical part of the self. Another might be a more feeling or empathic part. One might be all about helping others, and another might be about making sure that the self has what it wants or what it needs. And yes, these parts, even contradictory parts, can all exist within a single individual. I'd like to take this metaphor a little deeper and suggest that, you know, like people themselves, each part has a particular way of being in the world. They might have a different goal. They might have different ways of acting. And before you think I'm suggesting some new food-oriented form of schizophrenia or psychosis, you know, just think about this. A person's way of being is often different at work than it is at home. And it's often different in a spousal relationship, in a spousal role, than it is in a parent role. I would suggest that most of us embody these different parts at different times and different situations in our lives. So this is where I bring in my strategy for fostering relational growth and repair. You know, find the part of yourself and another that connects the most, and spend time there with each other. You know, or another way to think about it is, you know, find the situations in which you connect most with another person, and you might consider just staying there. If you hold this view of people, you know, as being made up of parts, you'll likely see more possibilities in relationships, even ones that have become difficult in life. And so that sort of rounds out a lot of what I wanted to say. I tried not to repeat too much of what I said in the first seminar, so I tried to come up with some new themes and for our time tonight. Now, one thing I want to say before we wind down tonight is, of course, this idea that if you are going through something that is really stressful, if you're going through anxiety and it's lingering, there's a growing sense of depression, it's really important to reach out for help. And I think at Salford there's a number of resources, referrals that can be made, both internal to the community, but also without. So if that's you or that's a loved one, it's always important to reach out for help. And so that's it for tonight. I think I loaded the plate pretty full, but, you know, hopefully some of you got something out of our time together. I guess, Maria, if we have time for questions, or if anyone wants to even just share a story that came up for them that could be helpful to others, that would be a good use of the time we have left as well.
Thank you so much, James. There's so much here. I have 2 full pages of just these quick notes from what I was, stuff that I want to think about more. I don't have any questions yet in the chat, but feel free to just unmute yourself and say a question or something that you noticed, or a story that connects with this for you, or whatever you might like to add to this to deepen the conversation. I'll give a little bit of time for that.
I really like this, the Great Assessment name for this time that we're in. I think one of my fears is that we won't do it, but the hope is that there's richness if we do. And I'm wondering, James, if you could just repeat those 2 questions that you named as some that might help in that doing the reassessment. I have one of them as, what parts of my life have lost meaning or purpose during the pandemic? And I can guess at what the other one was, but I don't remember it.
Well, the other one was just, you know, where am I finding maybe new meaning now or new purpose in my life?
Yeah.
Another way to think about that is, where do I feel the draw? You know, you might have a sense of the things that are pulling you towards it. when it comes to meaning in life. Those are just feelings to pay attention to when it comes to this existential part of things.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
I also was thinking about that that phrase and that part of the task that's happening right now. I feel like I've heard of so many people who we've talked for a long time about kind of noticing what really matters and considering what we need to hold on to and what we need to let go of. And I'm wondering if you also named that kind of intentionality that's needed, because it's possible to kind of get stuck in that crisis moment and stagnation and that urge to reclaim what was, you called it. I'm wondering what tools or first steps there are to begin the process of stepping into the new future and kind of getting out of that paralysis that crisis can sometimes leave us in.
Yeah, there's a couple ways to think about that. If it's happening within a relationship, that's kind of a conversation. The first step is always, how can we talk about this and feel safe? These are hard conversations if we're talking about redefining relationship meaning and freedoms. And, part of the reason it doesn't happen is because people don't want to leave hurt, or maybe even they don't want to hurt the other one. And so I think, just as a preliminary thing, it's important to just sort of set some ground rules about how do we talk about this and feel like it's okay when we're done. Something I'll just say, if we're talking about personally, individually, dealing with these types of questions and change, I might turn to what sometimes, and some of you might know what I'm about to say, what's referred to as the stages of change. One way you can think about change and the way it happens is moving through these different stages. There's a stage of like pre-contemplation, meaning like I'm not really thinking about any type of change. And then sometimes there's what's called contemplative stage. I mean, you're just thinking about it. It's more like a thought experiment. What would that be like? After that is preparation. If you actually start doing research, or you start organizing parts of life to sort of move in whatever direction that was. After that is action, of course. Start taking serious steps forward. And the last stage is just sort of referred to as maintenance. Like you've sort of gotten into the new groove of where you want things to be. And now it's just a matter of maintaining that, knowing that there's always the gravitational pull of where we once were. You might call it the pull of routine in certain ways. Yeah. Did that answer your question? I don't know if that was what you were referring to, or.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just thinking about that process of getting somewhere new. Yeah.
Yeah.
What else do you want to name or reflect on or ask? And again, feel free to put it in the chat if you prefer.
One of the things that always is difficult for me doing Zoom events is I'm so used to, in something like this, walking around the room. I like to have one of the things I always request is a cordless mic, because I like to kind of mill about up and down the aisles. And sometimes I find like I can be present with everyone. Not that I don't feel present with you all here, but I guess I can't stand beside you and make you feel uncomfortable in a moment like this. I'll say something. Yeah.
I'll just make an observation. I'm thinking about how large the group was in the first webinar you did, the wintering the pandemic, and how small this group is tonight. And I'm wondering if that is a reflection of, you know, where we are in this, and whether that's a reflection of that it is going to be hard to carve out time and place and intention for paying attention, to keep paying attention. I don't know. Maybe people just had lots of different things in their schedules tonight, but that's part of the moving out of the pandemic. So I guess I'm just sitting with the question of how do we stay mindful ourselves and help other people stay mindful?
Yeah.
Sort of a rhetorical question, but maybe you have a comment on that too.
Oh yeah, sure. You know, it's an interesting thing. You know, the difference in size. What does that mean is the question. I think it's, you know, something Maria and I were talking about, we were just getting on, was maybe that's a reflection of, you know, people are out doing different things in life now. You know, there's so much time spent focused on these difficult topics, these hard parts of life. Maybe folks understandably are just turning their attention to some of the life-giving, not that this isn't, right? But some of the things that are maybe enjoyable in a different way. You know, sometimes in a session, either individually or couple session, they'll come in and, you know, they say, I don't really know what to talk about tonight. In fact, I was on the car ride over here and I was a little nervous, like I didn't know how I would spend the time. And, you know, one of the things I do is always say, well, you know, why don't you take a moment and we'll see what comes up. But, you know, the other thing is that I often say, maybe that's a sign that, you know, a good sign. Maybe that means that things are going okay enough right now. You know, sometimes when someone doesn't jump right into a story in therapy, it's because the week was all right. You know, it wasn't necessarily something that they really needed to process with me. Maybe, you know, with that in mind, the fact it's a lighter group is evidence that maybe people are doing more and more all right as we're getting into this different place in the pandemic. Yeah. But, you know, one thing I'll add too, how do we kind of not forget mental health, as there's like, okay, we're out of the mucky muck right now, you know, and I would say that, you know, Salford, you do a nice job with that. And just by always having something like this scheduled happening, you know, it's sort of like always just a reminder there. You know, that's a real intervention on the community level. You know, because there's always folks out there that are feeling out of sorts, or they feel like even though everyone else is doing better, they themselves are really struggling. So I feel like you don't forget those people by keeping up with stuff like this. Yeah.
Margaret put in the chat a question, and I wonder, Margaret, if you want to unmute yourself, you should feel free to expound on this. But it says, in the pull of routine, which you talked about just a minute ago, what are ways to address that pull as we enter the new normal?
How do we address that pull? Yeah. I guess in the way we're talking about it, it's like we don't want the pull of routine in this situation. You know, I guess it's always a question of why do we feel that pull? What is that about? Because I think that can mean different things for different people. You know, is that pull there because it is just habit? You know, sometimes though, it's are you in that routine because you think someone expects you to be? Who is that person? What would happen if you weren't in that routine with that person? Or on a more personal level, do you feel like you expect that of yourself? What would it mean to you personally if you were to step out of that? You know, these are the sorts of questions that sort of can get at some of the barriers that get in the way of kind of moving in a new direction in life. You know? Just one way to think about it. Yeah, good question though. I don't know if I answered it fully, Margaret. Maybe you got something, another part of that you wanted me to respond to.
No, I think that's it, James. I think during the year we sat back and reflected a bit, and we thought about where we had come from, and we had time to think about what we want for the future. But it's so good to get back to what we think is our new normal, which felt so much like our old normal that we forget our intentions in there. You talked about the fact that we need to recognize some of the things that perhaps we thought about and could change. So how do we get out of the, and you address that, how do we get out of the feeling that it is such a relief to be able to go back to what was, that we are less likely to think about what can be.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you. I think that was a really important thing to talk about.
I don't know if this is a question, but just kind of my experience. As I walk into a store, and maybe you talked about this because I joined probably 15 minutes into this, so maybe you already talked about this, but as I walked into a store today, and a couple times already since I've been vaccinated, and they have on the sign on the door saying, oh, if you're not vaccinated, you don't have to wear a mask. And I find myself hesitating, and then I want to wear the mask in there, and then when I get in there, there's multiple people that have masks on, so I end up putting it on, and really struggling with trusting the vaccine and saying, okay, I don't need to wear this mask anymore if I trust this, but yet others have the mask on and not knowing what that means. And then also having friends, close friends, that have decided not to get vaccinated, but then being able to trust it being okay to be with them without a mask because I'm trusting the vaccine. So it's a real struggle. And I, recently, just this week, just being in and out of stores and being out and about more, but also being with close friends of mine, just feeling that tension of how do I trust it? Do I not? And do I just be okay with it? And yet there's no conversation about, not being vaccinated, and yet I am, and how I feel about that. And so there's this kind of big elephant in the room, and you don't talk about it.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. I just think, that it's going to take time. We spent over a year, physiologically connecting groups, and especially groups where people weren't wearing masks, with death. Those neurons are like wired together, those things. And even though intellectually, I think we can understand, like, okay, we're in a different place. I'm safer. I'm vaccinated. We know that here. Our bodies don't know that. That's why the big text on trauma is entitled, The Body Keeps the Score. By Bessel van der Kolk. That's because it takes so much longer for our bodies to sort of catch up to where we're at. I'm instantly reminded of all the veterans that have been in my office that talk about what it's like to drive after being in some sort of conflict zone. Maybe they needed to go 70 miles an hour because that was what was safe at times, or maybe a trash can was always a real threat to their life. Did it contain some sort of explosive device? It is not an easy thing to start rebuilding our neurology around these concepts of what's safe and what's dangerous. And you all probably know, but in our minds, what's dangerous, bam, like we got it. It fuses that together. We're ready to avoid that danger. It's so much harder to take something that was dangerous and now move that into a category of safe. You know, that takes time and a lot of discomfort as we go through it. That's really hard work. Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. Got my mind percolating as you were talking there. Yeah.
That reminds me too of what you said, James, at the beginning about how quickly we, and almost automatically and easily in some ways, we set up these boundaries for our protection and our safety at the beginning of this and built our bubbles, but then to open the boundaries again is often harder and a longer process and requires that relearning and a sense of safety that is maybe elusive at times, and certainly now is conflictive, like what Marlene was saying. And that's why I think this is really an important conversation to be having, because like you said, that languishing continues for many, and we're not kind of all better. There's still a lot that our bodies need to relearn and our minds need to relearn as we continue to slowly come out of this pandemic. Yeah, are there final things that you want to say, James?
Oh, just that it's good to be with you all. You know, I really enjoy being connected to Salford. So thanks for coming tonight. And it was a privilege to be speaking with you.
Thanks, James. Yeah, just to name again that as a pastoral team and as a congregation, this is one of the ways that we walk together in life in God's presence and with God's support, and sometimes not feeling that support as much as other times, sometimes feeling more connected with one another and sometimes less. But it's something that we do together as a community. And so, yeah, Beth and Dorcas and I are all on here and certainly available for more conversation. This isn't the end of the conversation. This is maybe another touch point along the way, but let's keep checking in about this and noticing what's happening in our own bodies and minds and in our neighbors, and reflecting on what we need as we go forward. And we'll keep doing that too as leaders in the community.
All right, thanks.
Yeah. All right, Margaret says thanks for being part of our pizza.
Yeah.
Pleasure. All right, good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.